Hey listeners, we're nearing the end of our 15th anniversary fundraising campaign, and we need your help to meet our goal. This campaign offers you a chance to win a unique food and music experience in one of the most exciting cities in America. Here's how it works. Donate to HRN and you'll be entered to win dinner for two and 2 tickets to a concert in one of 8 amazing cities: New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Nashville, Las Vegas, Charleston, Ardmore, Pennsylvania, and Asheville. All donations support our work educating food system storytellers. And when you donate, you can choose one of those cities and you'll be entered to win dinner and 2 tickets to a show. So help us reach our goal and enter to win dinner and a show in the city of your choice. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15. Thank you.
This episode is brought to you by Hearst Ranch, grass-fed beef raised on California's Central Coast. Available seasonally at select Whole Foods markets. Learn more at HearstRanch.com.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. With more than 30 weekly podcasts, HRN has something for every food lover. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
This is Gastronomica, a Heritage Radio Network podcast. I'm your host for today, Sina Rousseau. This series is produced in collaboration with Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies, published by the University of California Press. Our spring season begins with Gastronomica's newest issue, 23.4, now available online via UCP's site, and features conversations on food memory, community, and the meanings of sugar and sweets. Fittingly for HRN's celebration of community through food during the month of February, my guest this week is Elora Halim Chowdhury, joining us to discuss her recently published article titled "What Does Food Sustain? Family, Class and Culture in South Asian Identity Making." Elora is a professor of women's, gender and sexuality studies at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, where her research interests extend to transnational feminism, gender violence and human rights, and also South Asian cinema. Thank you for joining us, Elora, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Now, for listeners who have not had the chance to read your article yet, could you briefly tell them what it's about? And particularly also, given that you start with saying that it is an autoethnographic piece, what the role of autoethnography is?
Sure. Thank you for that question. So I'm a feminist scholar interested in gender, patriarchy, and power relations. And I'm also an immigrant, a woman of color in the US, interested in questions of belonging, loss, meanings of community and care in a diasporic setting. And this article is really fundamentally about identity and our place in the world and how that gets articulated through food pathways. And what I mean by that is the production and consumption, distribution of foods, and how that shapes who we are in the world and our location. And this interest really solidified for me during the COVID-19 pandemic, when in our multi-generational household in Boston, Massachusetts, I live with my elderly mother who is 80, above 80 at this time, my 2 children, young boys, and my spouse. And what I observed was that for my mother, who lived through the independence war of Bangladesh in the early 1970s, a very devastating war that left the nation and everybody living through that time with very traumatic memories. My mother was triggered by living through COVID, and questions of caregiving and practices of care within the family, and how, in particular, women are positioned as caregivers in the family, and also caregivers of the nation at times of war. These surfaced through many conversations we were having, and often in the kitchen when I was cooking, and she would narrate stories of scarcity, and how there used to be a curfew and not enough food to go around, and how the women in the family in particular rationed the food and what kinds of things were available. So it really brought home to me this whole question of not only intergenerational trauma, and that how that is articulated through food practices, but also how we learn to perform our gender, do our gender, and in a transnational diasporic context too, through our memories of these stories. So I would say that is what led to writing this story, which also became about questions of inequality and class and race and social divisions in the world, and how those get articulated through food pathways.
Absolutely. Isn't it interesting how probably there was so much reflection, or people had more time for reflection during the COVID-19 pandemic and various lockdowns. And there's been some really interesting work that's come out of that in terms of remembering and what that means. And I was going to ask, maybe this is something that we can come back to later, about what the particular lens of, you say, a feminist lens adds to it, because in the kind of broad area of food studies, a relatively nascent interdisciplinary academic field, if you like, some of the things that you talk about, which are, descriptions of hierarchies and social structures and so on, whether coming at it from a lens of history or anthropology or even media, might uncover some of the same sorts of hierarchies that do result in those very gendered positions. But if we can get into some of the kind of details of the article, which there are so many fascinating ones. I mean, you have this vivid and a number of engaging descriptions of what you call a festive and joyful childhood, including your extended family visiting for sometimes extended periods of time in a home that you also describe as stately, where there were cars with drivers and there was domestic staff, privileges that were afforded or earned through your father's academic status as eventually a university vice chancellor, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Still, that abundance of family and the hospitality expectations that came with it added substantially, you write, to my mother's domestic labor. And you also explain that the status of living in that largely British colonial style, you were in Bangladesh at this in the earlier part of your piece.
Yes.
That the status didn't equal affluence, right? So your family meals, while they were sufficient, were measured rather than abundant. For example, there was sometimes not enough meat to go around at breakfast, a meal where your father would routinely attend wearing a suit and tie to be seated next to his mother, your grandmother, where they would both be served meat from the night before, where the rest of you would have roti shobji. Am I saying that right?
Yes,
shobji. Okay.
That's correct.
And omelets prepared with onions, coriander, and green chilies. So there's this intriguing tension between a kind of privilege and also a relative deprivation. due to maybe class and or gender, but still a strong sense of community building throughout that, even with the staff who are mentioned as either maids or servants, but people who were in your family, essentially.
Yes.
And I'm sorry, this is a long-winded question, but a key thing I wanted to ask was whether your mother ever, when you talk about all of that hospitality leading to additional domestic labor for her, whether it was ever self-inflicted in any way. In other words, did she ever reject any available help via the domestic staff and so on who could have maybe helped because there was an expectation or a desire to be in charge in a matriarchal way of the household?
I'll begin with the first part of your question, which asked about a feminist methodology to studying social inequalities and what does the study of food pathways reveal about that. And I think, I go back to the feminist lesson of or saying that the personal is political, and by really focusing on women's narratives, that we can reveal how the micro levels of power also reflect the broader social structural powers. So I think the family structure that I describe also reflects a state discourse around power, also a colonial relation of power. All of that is revealed through some of the examples I provide in this article. So at one level, I can think about my childhood, which was a very privileged childhood in many ways. We grew up in a middle class family. Both my parents and their parents held degrees in higher education. They had positions like physician, my father as an academic. They worked for government sector jobs, which afforded them these large stately mansions and cars that were driven by drivers, domestic staff. At the same time, the salary itself was not high. So it was a life of status and prestige for sure, but there was also a lot of negotiating around the cost of living and how to maintain that kind of life. So it was not that we had abundant supply of food, and I always think about it in terms of a value system too. That the food portions were always very measured, and in a sense, it also reflected the time period that I'm talking about in the 70s and 80s, where most people in urban Dhaka, Bangladesh, where I grew up, were not going out to restaurants to eat. The culture was much more that you entertained at home, dinner parties or family gatherings, and they all circulated around food. But again, the distribution of it, if you think about it in terms of the family table, it in a way also reflected your social location in the world and sort of the cultural context in which we were living. So on the one hand, it is a time period of my life that was very joyful and living with extended family. At the same time, those joyful memories mask certain kinds of hierarchies. So who was doing the work behind the dining table, the shopping for the food, the cooking for the food. It was enabled by the domestic staff that was afforded by these high-level jobs that my father held. And again, I think feminist methodology here helps us unmask that hidden role of the service people who enable the kind of lifestyle that I can think about now through this lens of nostalgia and in loss. But again, it was the labor of the people who actually made that available to us often get obscured. And I talk about this example of how in the semi-feudal class structure of South Asia, that we tend to talk about domestic staff as part of our family, because many of them have been with us for generations. However, there is still that division of how we are not seated at the same table when we eat, or we are not eating the same foods either. So the food prepared for the domestic staff is separate and different. And often, they're bulked up through filler items. While for the middle class family too, meat was not in abundance, we tended to eat it more as a side dish than the main dish, which is what is often the case in this country, in the U.S., right? The protein is often the main dish, and the carbs and vegetables, these are the side dishes. It was quite different. In the context that I grew up. So I think, those kinds of hierarchies are very much at play when I think about the family dining table, and even in terms of a gendered and age hierarchy, how the head of the dining table was always occupied by my father and my grandmother as the head matriarch in a way. And the children, we were seated more along the sides, and my mother would sit to the left of my father and serve everybody. And in a way, it is the gendered role that she played as the woman of the household. But also it was a way to portion the food, because there wasn't enough for everyone to have seconds, right? There was only one serving of the meat or the fish, and she would also give certain portions, choice portions to my father or my brother, who I grew up with four siblings and 3 sisters and 1 brother. So there was, I would tell my mother this, that favoritism towards the son. Maybe some of that was true, that, but there was also that I was the youngest child, and I would also get some of the choice portions sometimes. My sister, who was the middle child, reminds me of that. So in a way, that where you are seated at the family table also reflects your social position in the family and also in the world in general.
Absolutely. That's so intriguing. And I'd love to maybe after the break get back to the question of memory, because you also mentioned that you and your sister have got slightly different memories of who got the choice bits at the table. But if I may just jump ahead, and this is because there is so much to unpack in your article. But what you'd mentioned now about your brother reminded me of, there is also a theme of, while you are describing, remembering, reliving in a way many of these family memories, there's a sort of theme of internalized shame and betrayal and guilt sometimes. For example, when you and your siblings were made to eat the animals that you had petted that had then been slaughtered, so you felt that the blood smelled of betrayal, to paraphrase you. And then there was also a feeling of guilt of taking food from kitchen staff, for example, where when they would feed you while your parents were having their naps and you would go and sit in the kitchen. And then, most related to your story about your brother is if you and your sister or your sister were caught pilfering the chocolate biscuits that your mother kept specifically for your brother in a tin on top of her cupboard. Uh, and that was just for him, I presume, given your description now of the sort of what people can expect based on their place at the table, metaphorically and literally. He was the boy. He got the special treats, and there was, in your words, you would have been shamed for your gluttony, which was doubly inappropriate because we were girls. Even though you yourself, in your words, were a sickly child, and that meant that you had a special privilege of having tang offered to you, right? So tang, for listeners who may not be aware, is I think, a heavily sugared kind of processed concentrate or cordial that you make into juice. These were social and gendered hierarchies that you seem to understand as a child, like on the occasion that some of your visiting cousins asked you to make them some tang, something which you described as very gutsy because it was clearly out of place. It was a very expensive thing, and also it was kind of meant for you. Um, it was almost like you were ashamed for them. So I was interested in, first of all, you don't say whether you actually made the tang for them, so whether you joined them in their rebellion against the kind of expectations and rules, because I presume they knew about them rather than being oblivious to them, and they knew that they were probably crossing a boundary, like when they also coerced you into having a New Year's Eve party that resulted in some co-ed sleeping arrangements, as you put it.
Yes, that's a wonderful question. And I think, I grew up in a family of very strong women. So my grandmother, who I talk about in the article, who lived with us, she lived to be 100, and she was blind for much of that time that I knew her. Yet she knew exactly what was going on in the household. And she had this sort of, tremendous, strong will. And we were both afraid of her for her capacity to know everything despite not being able to see. And at the same time, we sometimes had a tremendous fun at her expense as children, that we would tell her all kinds of stories about things that were happening, which actually were not happening. And she would always know that, we were trying to trick her into believing something. But I say all this that, because I grew up with her, my mother, who herself, again, a very strong presence in the household. My aunt, my mother's younger sister, who in a way was my mother's right hand in running the household. My eldest sister, who is 10 years my senior, also I describe in the article how she was my father's right hand in a way, because as a university administrator, he had to take care of various developments happening all around the clock. And sometimes when he had social events in the evening, she's the one who would field calls, even though she was just a teenager at that time, and inform him if something important was developing on the campus and he needed to take care of it right away. So in that kind of an environment, although, since I only have one brother, he certainly had male privilege in the family. But I think, in a way, my mother's affection towards him and providing him with these chocolate biscuits, and they were imported chocolate biscuits, which was really critical in the story, along with the tang, because these were not easily available at that time. They were expensive. They were really markers of some kind of a coveted food item that was only available in very small portions. And so my mother saving the chocolate biscuit for my brother was, in a way, yes, he was kind of the apple of her eye, but also he was not as strong as all the women in the family. And, in a way, you tend to shower affection on a child who may need more attention because he's not getting that kind of an attention or is not a strong presence in other ways, like my sister was, or other members of the family was. So I see it, in both ways, that the food itself was very special and rare in the household, and it was saved for him because he wasn't like a typical male child who was, spoiled, or we might think of someone who getting all that attention as a result of being a male child or the only male child in the family. And also, this at the same time, yes, because I had certain health conditions as a child, I was, often considered a sickly child. I also was showered with attention, and I had all these needs around what kinds of things I could eat or not eat. And the doctors asked my parents to always give me lots of different kinds of fluids for my condition. So tang, again, an imported product that was not easily available. It was expensive, what was reserved for me in the family. And I think my cousins were a little bit afraid of my mother too, and they would not demand that, make me a glass of tang too. But they decided to have it when she was not in the house. And that is what I thought was, again, gutsy, because they were guests, and as guests, you don't make demands. And also they were children too. So, their location in the family was such that they couldn't really dictate the terms of what kind of food they would get or not get. And they, chose that those times when my mother would be out of the house to ask for the tang. And we had, of course, domestic staff who would make the tang for them. Their place in the household was such that they could not say no to the guests, even if they were children and did not have a higher social location in the family. They still could not say no to them. But they would also always report it to my mother when she came home, that tang was made for people that it was not intended for. And so it reflects both our socioeconomic identity and that location of having status, but not necessarily the economic means to have abundant food, and also children's location within the family.
Absolutely. That's really interesting, especially as, although you had mentioned domestic staff throughout your article, when it came to the tang story and your cousins asking for them, it was only insofar as you describe it that they had asked you to make it, but not that they might go behind your back and ask the servants. Maybe it sounds like your cousins were maybe quite manipulative. Anyway, but so they got their tang, and you also don't describe really their genders, but we can maybe touch on that after the break. We're going to take a short break now, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Hearst Ranch, in collaboration with Whole Foods Market, is proud to be the presenting sponsor of The Farm Report, a special HRN series in collaboration with the National Young Farmers Coalition. Tune in each week to hear from farmers, policymakers, organizers, and food advocates about all the ways the Farm Bill directly impacts our lives, whether we realize it or not. They'll break down farm policy and talk to young farmers about what hangs in the balance for them as another farm bill gets made. Join the coalition to shift power and change policy for the next generation of growers and land stewards. The future of good food depends on it. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org or wherever you listen to podcasts.
And we're back. This is Gastronomica on Heritage Radio Network. I'm Sina Rousseau talking with Elora Halim Choudhury about her article titled What Does Food Sustain? Family, Class and Culture in South Asian Identity Making, now available in Gastronomica issue 23.4. So before the break, we were talking briefly about how your cousins had manipulated you and all the domestic servants into making them tang. On the topic of that led us to that, which was about a sort of sometimes a shame or a guilt that ran through some of the practices that you describe in your piece about privilege, perhaps, of having more than other people and so on. There's a very poignant moment towards the end of your article where you talk about someone who you describe as a maid or family servant, Hawa. I hope I'm saying her name correctly, who had been with your family since the age of 7. And she, at a later stage, I gather you were both adults by that time, accompanied you to visit family friends. And there was what feels like a very awkward situation reading it, certainly, where she was not offered the same food, cutlets, I believe, as everyone else who was in the lounge. And as you write, and I quote, out of Bodrota, am I saying that right? Which you translate as middle-class respectability norms, I could not bring myself to intervene. But you did feel ill afterwards, as the hierarchies acceptable to you as a child were clearly no longer, in your words again, palatable to my body. Now, it's clearly a very difficult moment for you to confront, partially as that rebellion might, in your words again, draw attention to my outsider status as a Westerner imposing foreign standards in a local culture. And I'm wondering why you think that was the particular moment that you seemed to take exception to the practices that you were so familiar with and accepting of growing up, rather than boldly being the sort of naughty child that facilitated the tang for your cousins and didn't care about overstepping boundaries.
You know, I think I have lived in the US for the last 30-some years, and as a feminist scholar, I study power relations and social class and hierarchies and gender division of labor. And there's a novelist, Triti Umrigar, who writes about this relationship between middle-class families and the domestic staff, and this sort of separation of space, figuratively and literally, that happens between the domestic staff and family members. And these are organized around caste and class system, and notions of purity and pollution. They govern the ways in which space is organized within the family and the household. And I think that as much as that is, middle class folks in South Asia like to say that, servants in the family who have worked for the family for generations are part of the family, the social relations are still governed by the spatial organization. And Hawa, who has been with our family since the age of 7, still has to, despite being thought upon as someone who is part of the family, sits in a different space when she's taking her meals than sit with the family at the dinner table. And what I describe in the article, that in a visit to a family friend's home who also have known Hawa for decades because of our close family relationship. Well, they crossed the boundary to a certain extent. So they did not ask Hawa to go sit with the domestic staff in their house in the kitchen, but Hawa sat with the family and me in the living room, however, not on the sofa, but she sat on an ottoman on the side of the room. And when food was served, it was a number of items, but the choice item was the prawn cutlets. And that choice item was not offered to Hawa. And this kind of feudal relationship that governs social life in South Asia is very much normalized, and one that I grew up and was not necessarily disruptive of as a child. And as an adult, having had that distance for so many years, I think that I see the awkwardness, the unequal relationships getting produced and reproduced, and with myself very much being part of that reproduction. I see it more acutely. It does create a great deal of discomfort, a sense of injustice. However, my own social location, and to the extent that it has been ingrained in my identity, still prevented me from speaking up at that moment and disrupting that order. Right, it was disrupted to a certain extent. That yes, Hawa was sitting with us in the living room and not in the kitchen, but in terms of the food items, she still wasn't offered the items equally. Right, that everybody else in the room was partaking of this very fine delicacy, and she was not. And my social location it still prevented me from taking that risk. And because there is that risk of being told that, well, you don't live in Bangladesh, you have these sort of foreign and Western ideas of equality, and those are not appreciated as much as in this kind of context. And it would strain my relationship. And I was a guest in that household. I did not disrupt that relation and I experienced that as a moment of guilt and shame, certainly.
It must have been very difficult, as I said, certainly a difficult moment to read about. But what you're describing is also, I suppose, a loss of a privilege that you might have had before, where maybe you transitioned from feeling more at home in Bangladesh, and then later having moved to the States and assuming an identity a little bit as a quote Westerner, as you put it, and that is, I suppose, really the interesting question about writing, the process of writing, which I'd like to get to before we run out of time, and how important it is for you to sort of relive and rethink, and what also you can imagine that this reading your article and something like an autoethnography can bring, what the experience can bring to readers also for their own experiences. But before we get there, if we can touch quickly on the issue of memory, and you and your sister differing on who got the choice drumsticks, I believe they were the choice bits of the chicken, because that one could, I think you said that one could chew on their bones and suck their juices. So you remember them going to your father and your grandmother, and your sister remembers them going to you. And so, as you were talking about how some of the practices, how you try to at least bring some of the practices of your childhood into your own life, and you are certainly reflecting on a lot of them, I'm wondering how you negotiate the role of memory in this pursuit of an autoethnography as a kind of social sciences pursuit.
Sure. Yes, I think that feminist food scholars have also talked about how food is centrally implicated in identity. It is centrally implicated in who we become. And in terms of performing a certain kind of gendered identity within the family, that there is a certain kind of passing on of tradition between first generation and the second generation. And I go back to the kitchen space often, where in my family, I do most of the food shopping and cooking. And these are lessons that I have learned from my own mother and the way that she has run her household. And my memory of growing up in the family that I describe in this article, and how that still shapes the practices that I perform in my family in a diasporic context in the United States. So, for instance, for Eid, the Muslim religious holiday and festival that comes after the month of Ramadan, I grew up in a family where my mother always hosted an open house on Eid days, and all of my father's colleagues in the university and our relatives would come by throughout the day, and there was always a feast that had been prepared. And this is something that I try to replicate in my small family in Boston, and invite my friends and my neighbors. And it's very much generated by food memories, and it shapes who I am in this context, as a Muslim, as an immigrant woman in the U.S. So I think, but there is always a failure in a sense, right? Because it can never match up to the grandeur of the memory that I have of those celebrations in the family. And partly because, again, there is a certain glorification of those memories that was enabled again by domestic labor, of the hidden labor of staff that I've spoken about earlier in the segment. And here in the domestic context, of course, I have to do bulk of the labor myself. So as that also, shows kind of the gendered social reproduction of labor in a sense, but also it shows that, who are the people who are caring for you, and where the hierarchies that sort of govern that space as well. And I think that, food memories, when we delve into them as illuminating of personal social location, but also how these are political, that they're determined by who has the power to have these sort of, lavish open houses and gatherings, and again, who enables that for you is very much part of the story. And again, I will also say that the practices change, right? Because in terms of this is how I see myself performing my ethnic identity too, as a minority in the United States, and turning to sort of authentic ways of producing the food, right? So instead of using the easy masala mixes that you can use to prepare biryani, which is a staple or a signature food for special occasions like Eid. I also make it a point to do everything from scratch. And again, that adds to the labor, but it kind of adds to a certain kind of authentic identity as a South Asian woman. Also, the image that, I can host these beautiful parties and have do all the work myself,
Do all the work
whereas
yourself.
easy fixes like the masala mix would probably make it a lot easier. But so these kinds of uh, things are also brought up in terms of the memory of how the festival is celebrated in the past, and how it can be tried to replicate it, to build community, to build a sense of a family heritage and certain kinds of traditions. But again, there is gendered labor that is very much part of the story, and who gets to do that, perform that, tell a certain story about the food.
Absolutely. So, which goes back to an earlier question. I don't think, and this is probably my fault, that you didn't get a chance to answer when I was asking about when or if some of your mother's heightened domestic labor was perhaps self-inflicted, in the sense that she had turned or not turned down the help available to her, but preferred to do it herself. And that's what I was reminded of when reading about how you were trying to recreate these open house Eid celebratory meals. And in your words, you wrote that you were willfully choosing to do the cooking on my own instead of catering out, even though, and your words again, the labor made for pure exhaustion. So there is something very interesting about the performance that you talk about, and who has the time to do the labor, and
Right. Yes.
the choice to do
Absolutely.
it, and of course the money to do it. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, now, so wrapping up this fascinating conversation, there's a lot here about how nostalgia, as you've spoken about, nostalgia for childhood, the move to recreate, to remember, to write about, can become full of contradictions between the romanticism of something, and not to mention the fallibility of memory, which we spoke about already, where your sister remembers one thing about the drumsticks and you remember another. Uh, but so there's that romanticism, and then there is something that might come out as, in your words, unrecognized discomfort, anger, and even violence, speaking about those social structures and those discomforts. For example, Howard sitting in the lounge and not being offered the cutlet that everyone else gets. So that's one of the things that happens as these idylls are sort of unmasked as resulting from deeply uncomfortable social structures. But I think you're suggesting that it is a necessary unmasking. So there is something of value to you as a scholar, as a writer, and there will be something of value to readers to go through this journey of, even uncomfortable as it might be at times, to think about those things that shape the way that we think about ourselves and how we perform our place in a family or gender, or however we choose to frame it, depending on our discipline or perspective.
That's correct. And one of the important things that I will mention about writing about food pathways is that this also came out of a collaborative work that I'm doing with a number of women of color scholars who are also exploring food pathways. And we came together to talk and write about this again during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are a group that we are situated in different parts of the US, in different institutions. We come from different countries, and we are immigrants. And it became very apparent during our conversations and co-writing also that many of these gendered practices, the labor, the class hierarchies, the experience of being in the diaspora and the feelings of yearnings and loss and romanticism and what that masks are very much shared across the group. And I think that there is a certain value, of course, to talk about this in a cross-cultural context as well, and what a feminist methodology of looking at women's narratives as important, as critical, and what kinds of stories those reveal about power and inequality in a global context is a contribution that I think might get bypassed in other kinds of disciplinary focus on food or other kinds of social relations and studies of social relations. So that's certainly there. And I'm also thinking of my mother, who would again tell me many stories about living through the war in 1971 and how those stories were very different from the stories that my father, who's an intellectual and a political activist, he and his associates would tell about the war. Their stories were mostly about male leadership and national government, whereas my mother and my aunts, they would tell us stories about what was available during the war, who was feeding the family, the rationing of the food. And again, their stories humanized the war for us. So it seems that women were running the nation, they were serving the nation, right? And similarly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw the crisis in caregiving in the US, globally, and the people most affected were people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged in society. The healthcare practices were failing, and food was scarce, and all of these stories, when we listen to women's stories, they illuminate the human side of the crisis in a way. And I think that's what we have observed in this sort of collaborative work that I speak of. And again, in the work that I'm continuing to do in this relationship of food and memory and identity, that feminist methodology contributes something to learn about power and hierarchy and social inequalities in a transnational context.
It is certainly a very valuable resource, and we are delighted to have published your article in Gastronomica. And so I want to thank you, Elora, for joining us to talk about it. Listeners will be able to read the full piece in Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies, issue 23.4, which is now online by the University of California Press's Gastronomica site. For more details, you can also visit gastronomica.org, where you can see the full table of contents. Join us next week and subscribe to the Gastronomica podcast feed on your favorite platform to stay updated on our newest episodes this season.
This show is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.